that this organization, this group of defectors calling themselves the Free Syrian Army, is asking the international community, the United Nations, for a no-fly zone and for a naval blockade. They believe that this will then allow them to carve out some sort of a safe haven for even more defectors to begin to move to. This would then allow them to build up an opposition, a rebel army, if you will, in this area that would not be threatened by any sort of aerial bombardment. This kind of a move, the Free Syrian Army believes, would allow for a greater number of defections to take place. One of the big challenges has been in trying to hide these defectors once they decide to turn against the Syrian security forces. Now, at this point in time, the Free Syria Army really just numbers in the thousands, but they have been growing increasingly active.
Let me ask you what a president, Paul, would do. If you were president at this moment about a couple of world hotspots. Number one is Syria. The United Nations Security Council, because of a veto by China and Russia, did not pass a resolution the Obama administration wanted, putting more pressure on President Assad. The President of the United States has said he believes Assad should step down. You've seen the reports and the videos, I'm sure, of the killing and the bloodshed, a government killing its own citizens. What would a President Paul do about that right now?
Well, that problem has been going on for many, many years, if not centuries. Bad governments, look at what they did. The communists killed millions, hundreds of millions of people. So it's a tragedy that happens in Africa all the time. But I'm not representing those countries. As a congressman and as a president, I represent the United States. And I don't think it's a wise thing to get involved in the civil war that's going on in Syria. That would cost money, it would cost lives, and it may well spread. And already, because we are agitating, we're already very much involved, trying to get the UN to do this and that. And the Russians now don't like it, the Chinese don't like it. So what should be a domestic civil war is now turning into an international crisis. And the Russians and the Chinese are reacting to us by pushing this. I think it's none of our business. I think it's a tragedy, but I can point out many tragedies, many folds greater than this, but it's not in American interest. Now, as president, if there was a crisis like this and was building, and somebody's making the case, oh no, it's in America's national security, I'd go to the Congress. I wouldn't go to the United Nations or NATO. I'd go to Congress and say, do you think this deserves a war? If it does, you declare the war, then we'll go to war, fight, and win it. But to assume that we have an automatic obligation to be over there, I think is a very dangerous thing to assume.
But how?
We should start considering all options, including arming the...
Some of these proposals that people are brooding about could not be done without foreign military intervention.
NATO's former Supreme Allied Commander, General George Jolowin, says unless the U.S. wants to go it alone, you need political agreement with other countries, and that hasn't happened yet.
If the world community did come together, could you have a Libyan-style campaign?
First of all, Syria is much different than Libya. You have to understand that. It's much more populated. There was a lot of desert in Libya, wide open spaces. There's a huge population in Syria. They have better defenses. They have better air defense systems. They have more and modern tanks. So it's going to take a much different sort of strategy than what occurred in Libya.
Then there's the neighborhood. Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq, Israel.
You have population areas in Syria that you didn't have in Libya. You had a few large towns, much more difficult. And if you're going to carry out a bombing campaign, what would that do to possible civilian casualties?
If the election were today, I do not think Obama would be reelected. But 3 years from now, things could change if say he played the war card. Say he decided to declare war.
You're not suggesting that he would cynically play the war card.
And by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? And he said, oh, it's worse than that. He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
The end of this smoke-filled street, an intersection littered with bodies. I count a dozen, a grisly tableau of urban warfare, the victims' hands bound behind them, The rebels say they were executed by Gaddafi's men. But these bodies appear to be black Africans. Black Africans make up a large portion of Gaddafi's army, raising questions about whether the men were executed by the rebels.
These terrible scenes sum up the horror of parts of Tripoli now. Bodies strewn across the street, gunfire echoing through the sky, and large parts of the city remaining a no-go zone.
It's difficult to imagine the ferocity of the bombardments that engulfed the streets of Sirte. This is Area 2 on the western side, where Gaddafi loyalists fought to the bitter end. Now the victorious NTC fighters parade proudly through the empty streets, but there's no sense of liberation here.
Party. Now, all this comes amid a major diplomatic standoff between Russia and China on one side and the West on the other side, with the West pushing for tougher sanctions against Syria and regime change in the country, and Russia standing for peaceful dialogue between both sides of the conflict. Now, just to tell you a bit more about how the Russian delegation was greeted there in Damascus today, truly a spectacular scene as the convoy with the foreign minister and the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service was going from the airport to the president's palace in Damascus. It was greeted by thousands, really thousands of people with flags, with Syrian flags, Russian flags, and Chinese flags. Many were chanting, "Thank you, Russia," and "Thank you, China." Actually, after that, I spoke with some of the members of the delegation, and they said at first they thought they were caught in the middle of a nationwide holiday. So spectacular this scene was, just a massive crowd of people. There were so many of them at some point the convoy even had to stop altogether.
The torture state which Libya has now developed, which just with Gaddafi's regime pales into was a much better human rights situation by any real standards. Now, Doctors Against Borders are feigning surprise, but frankly, they are being used in this way, and they're allowing themselves to be used. And it's high time, really, that the people across the world see these so-called human rights organizations for what they are. Basically the Trojan horses of Western foreign policy.
All right, one last question I want to toss in here. We only have a few seconds left, but how long do you see it before there is stability and peace in Libya?
Is there stability and peace today in Afghanistan? Is there stability and peace today in Iraq? As long as those people who are able to actually maintain some semblance of state stability and human rights, that's the old regime, as long as they're kept out of the current status quo, this will be the situation.
Now to our top story, Russia's foreign minister's visit to Syria. Sergei Lavrov's trip comes amid raging violence within Syria, as well as an international diplomatic standoff over how the unrest should be settled. For more on this, I'm joined from New York by United Nations Ambassador Vitaly Churkin. Thank you very much for spending your time with us now. So Western countries say Russia and China have, quote, blood on their hands because they refuse to back calls for Assad to step down. How do you answer those accusations?
Well, our effort was directed at ending bloodshed. Those who are accusing us have been trying to fan a civil war and conflict in Syria. So, I don't want to mimic them in using this kind of hysterical language, but we should have, they should recall their track record in dealing with the situation of Syria, supporting opposition sometimes with arms, with their calls for regime change. So the history will show, I think, that Russia has been doing everything we can and continues to do everything we can in order to put an end to violence and to resolve this crisis peacefully without Syria degenerating into a full-fledged civil war.
Now, diplomatic efforts have been going on for some time to try and settle the crisis politically, but they've failed to do so far. Do you still think it's possible for these opposing sides to sit down and thrash out some kind of compromise?
I do believe that this is the only outcome. Every conflict, needs to be resolved through negotiations. There are two ways, really, in my view. One is a frontal attack against the regime, something which I'm afraid has been happening lately, including from some important international players, the advocates of regime change. They've been trying to to resolve the crisis through frontally toppling the current government in Damascus. But this would mean bloodshed and civil conflict and really conflict which would be spreading beyond the borders of Syria. But the more rational way, the only way which the international community should be supporting is trying to put the parties to the table, to bring them to the table, and to arrange dialogue among them in order to find a political solution without further bloodshed. We, of course, are supporting the second.
A particular state used the veto power 50 times to protect Israel, and it continues to threat the use of the veto power. This could be considered as partaking in a genocide, as this conduct is tantamount to turning a blind eye and supporting the Israeli massacres in occupied Arab lands, let alone the misuse of the developments in Syria to divert international public opinion away from the legitimate Palestinian demands to have a fully fledged membership within the United Nations.
Area. Now, the BBC is reporting from Gariyan about the secret prisons, about the torture torturing that's going on. The BBC is feigning surprise that this is the outcome of the NATO enterprise in Libya. Everyone knew this. Everyone with a little bit of political nous and pragmatic reality could see that this was coming to pass. But what about Imam Tantoush, who's still tortured, and there's YouTube videos of him being tortured? What about Khalid Kaim? What about Hala Misrata? What about Mr. Dorda, the representative of the United Nations? Everyone in the United Nations knows Mr. Dorda. He is today being tortured, he is being tortured, and many other former senior regime people. Where is the Red Cross? Where is the United Nations? Are they facilitators to a NATO project in Libya, or are they actually there to provide some semblance of humanitarian support? So in terms of who's going to step in, I mean, who's going to step in to do what? What can they actually manage in Libya? It's a complete farce, and the people of Syria and the people of Lebanon and the people of the Global South have to see that what's happening in Libya is coming to them if they're not able to defend themselves and stop this rolling Western aggression against other countries.
Protesters say the National Transitional Council is failing to cover the basic needs of the people. Why do you think this is happening when there's so much oil wealth there?
This is happening because this is the business of the West, is to absolutely devastate and knock out any country that's an obstacle to their total domination
in front of the French embassy, coming about as a direct reaction to a trip taken by both ambassadors to Hama last week. The Syrian government has been really quite vocal in exactly how upset it was by that trip, saying that it was taken without the proper authorization. The Ministry of Interior, Wolf, had issued a statement accusing the U.S. ambassador of meeting with saboteurs and of inciting the demonstrations in Hama. And the government, as well as its supporters, have been pointing to this trip taken by the two ambassadors as being direct evidence of how foreign Western countries, namely the United States and France, are interfering in Syria's internal affairs, deliberately trying to destabilize this regime.
We know that the Syrian government has a responsibility to protect all foreign embassies in Damascus. What is the evidence, though, that the Syrian government may have been behind this attack on the embassy?
Well, there's no direct evidence that the Syrian government was directly behind this attack, but the U.S. has, however, been very critical of the Syrian security forces, saying that they were slow in responding.
It's 11:15 local time, so almost 11 hours of violence. It's 1,300 people killed in Tripoli alone, with 5,000 people injured. The hospitals cannot even cope with such death toll. So we are saying it out loud to the world that a peaceful city, these journalists lived here for a long time, and they could see that life was normal and peaceful in this great city, and now it's being turned into a hellfire because of NATO's actions. NATO is attacking the heart of a peaceful civilian city.